Good afternoon from Japan. I'm Jeffrey Ordonio, Assistant Professor of International Security Studies at Tokyo International University. Today, we're going to talk about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, a country often described in the literature as a rogue state, a hermit kingdom, and an impossible state. It remains poor, yet its pursuit of nuclear weapons has allowed it to get the attention of the international community. Since the 1980s, the United States has both confronted and engaged North Korea. In fact, the United States has tried both approaches over just the last 5 years. In 2018, when the Dprk declared itself a de facto nuclear-armed state, Washington swiftly changed its approach from what former President Donald Trump described as fire and fury to diplomatic summits hosted in Southeast Asia. In 2019, summit diplomacy lost its magic, and the COVID-19 pandemic brought everything to a halt. But questions still remain regarding how to best manage North Korea's nuclear, missile, and military provocations, and what is the right approach to convince Pyongyang to denuclearize. Also, what is the role of Southeast Asia in all of these? Welcome to another TIU International Affairs Seminar series. For this session, we are joined by one of the most respected voices in the region when it comes to Korea policy, Dr. Chiew Ping of the National University of Malaysia. A little bit about our speaker. Dr. Chiew Ping is Senior Lecturer in Strategic Studies and International Relations at the National University of Malaysia. She's currently a member of the Consultative Council on Foreign Policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Malaysia, Adjunct Lecturer at the Malaysian Armed Forces Defense College, and the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations of Malaysia. She was previously Council Fellow, Global Future Council on the Korean Peninsula at the World Economic Forum until September 2021, Korea Foundation Fellow at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies Malaysia from 2019 until 2020, Shangri-La Dialogue's Southeast Asia Young Leaders Program, Associate Research Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies Asia in Singapore, where I met her for the first time at the Shangri-La Dialogue a couple of years ago, Academy of Korean Studies Research Fellow in 2011, and Korea Foundation Field Research Fellow at Seoul National University in 2010. So while her research is focused on the Korean Peninsula security, she also works on the security and economic linkages between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, among many others. And Dr. Hu received her PhD in politics and international relations from La Trobe University, Australia. Dr. Hu is consulted by Malaysian and international media on Korean security issues, which appear in English and Mandarin, including BBC News, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and South China Morning Post, just to name a few. Also joining us today is my colleague, Professor Sojin Shin, who will provide some quick remarks after the presentation. Then we will proceed with Q&A. So before I turn over to our distinguished speaker, let me first give you some reminders or some disclaimers. All remarks, including those during the question and answer portion, are on the record, and we are live not just on the Zoom platform, but also on Facebook. So please be mindful of that. So without further ado, let me turn over to our guest speaker, Dr. Chiew Ping.
Thank you so much, my very good friend, Dr. Jeffrey Ordonio, for your very kind introduction. And I'm very glad to see Professor Shin Sojin is also with us today. So hi everyone, at the Tokyo International University, it is my honor to share my research on the Korean Peninsula with all of you. So I must thank the organizer to invite me to speak about North Korea. So as recently, there is not many news when it comes to North Korea, and I think this should not be forgotten. And so when something happens in the very near future, we can prepare for it. So my presentation today would be a kind of a guideline where I try to raise some of the pertinent issues related to the Korean Peninsula. So with that in mind, allow me to share screen. Geez, okay. So confronting or engaging the DPRK or North Korea has been the major questions that many, not only of us, but people in the Washington, DC, in Seoul, in Tokyo, in Beijing are asking, well, how best to manage this issue that related not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also Northeast Asia. So in the recent decades, so just very quickly, we have witnessed the confrontational stance ever since Kim Jong-un took over the power when his father, Kim Jong-il, passed away in December 2011. So next month would mark 10 years of Kim Jong-un in power. So as soon as he took over from the North Korean regime, in 2012, the ongoing negotiation that was conducted under his father's regime with the Obama administration, we witnessed he went ahead with the Kwangmyong-song satellite launch that eventually fell the 2012 Leap Day agreement reached between the government of the United States and DPRK. So there is a huge gap year here from since 2012 until 2017, where the strategic patience, as characterized by some of the Obama administration's officials, has not yielded any substantive progress. That was also the period where people witnessed that DPRK or North Korea has bought time to make progresses in its intercontinental ballistic missile development and also conducting nuclear tests. So it reached to a new height in 2017, where a second Korean War tension has been renewed when the Trump administration, especially by President Donald Trump himself, using very provocative rhetoric like fire and fury, the pressing of the nuclear buttons. So that does not stop North Korea from continuing their weapons program, and that includes the eventual Hwasong 15 ICBM test in November 2017, the longest range of ICBM tests conducted by any country in this world. So that actually prompted the success of Moon Jae-in government's outreach to North Korea, whereby the year of 2018 became the year of diplomacy, summit diplomacy to be exact. And right before that, just like the Leap Day agreement, trust politics that was launched by Park Geun-hye government did not yield any positive progress as well. Whereas in 2018, we witnessed Panmunjom Declaration at the DMZ of North and South Korea, the Singapore Declaration between Trump and Kim Jong-un, followed by the Inter-Korean summits in Pyongyang, which yielded the Pyongyang Declaration, which is military in nature and may be overturned by the next conservative government if the conservative candidate is to be elected to be the next president next year. So, of course, the Hanoi summit where Trump, infamously walking away from the deal, left the current situation in the stalemate, and the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak did not change this situation, whereby North Korea continued to conduct limited provocation, smaller scale and short-range missile tests, and the military parade. So they have made new progresses in other weaponry systems, including the submarine launch ballistic missiles, ultra-modern tactical weapons that was revealed by the Party Congress earlier this year that may be hypersonic in nature or nuclear tactical weapons. So right now, North Korea is a de facto nuclear armed power. And what does that say about how should the United States and South Korea deal with it? So there are a wide range of policy options that has been adopted by the US and South Korea against North Korea. They can be ranging from the spectrum of highly confrontational to the one that is reconcilable and engaging North Korea. So under each taxonomy of those policy options, hardline, coercive diplomacy, and conciliatory, there were many combinations that has been adopted because the US and South Korea are not always seeing eye to eye or adopting the same type of policy options when it comes to North Korea. So the US maintained their long-term position of deterrence and external deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, asserting ultimatum when necessary at the crisis point, and applying maximum pressure in the form of sanctions compliance and the Treasury Department's issuance of requests for a certain North Korean personnel to be investigated and to be extradited to the US for trials. Coercive diplomacy is a combination of what under the Clinton administration famously called the carrots and sticks. I prefer what Professor Alexander L. George has promoted, the coercive diplomacy in the form of forceful persuasion. So in this regard, the North Korea will be treated with the basic level of respect in which they are a potential partner to be persuaded into taking some form of action. But in recent decade, what we have witnessed is North Korea has been deemed as a not a type of a partner that can stand seeing eye to eye with the United States and sometimes by South Korea, but and a state actor, a raw state that should be contained and dealt with carefully. So this is why there were problems with mutual and reciprocal steps that can be implemented between US and North Korea. And the question between North Korea and South Korea is not as easy as they envision it to be. And over the conciliatory policy options, there were options such as engagement, which can be mutual and reciprocal between US, North Korea, or inter-Korean. There were also reciprocal exchanges of goodwills, minimum level, even though they are not at the sub-mid or top level. And then there were appeasement. So it was allegedly a form of appeasement when you give up on your national security position, undermining your defense. So this was especially the case of South Korea. Under Roh Moo-hyun administration and also Moon Jae-in, time and time again, some of the hawkish US analysts accused South Korea of being introducing appeasement approach to North Korea, which may damage the foundational goal of denuclearization. So how can we interpret what has happened in the very short year of 2018? So with the stalemate over between South Korea, North Korea, and the United States, the biggest winner seems to be China. So Xi Jinping met Kim Jong-un 3 times in 60 days, in 3 months, over from I think late March until June of 2018. So since the outbreak of pandemic, North Korea has effectively shut down all air travels and also disallowed ships to disembark on their ports and closing most of the roads. So with the lockdown mode imposed by North Korea itself, its internal lockdown was so severe that the impact was said to be much more greater than the sanctions imposed under the maximum pressure campaign. So that also illustrates and lead to one of the discussion that we will have later about sanctions. And with the engagement and containment or confrontational approach that was being promoted by US and South Korea. So when we compare both countries' approach to North Korea, US often imposed condition, while South Korea imposed less condition or no condition at all to restart talks, dialogues, and negotiation. And in terms of pressure, domestic pressure in United States is so high, such as the case in Trump, that he chose to walk away from the Hanoi summit, refused to agree to the reciprocal visits of Yongbyon nuclear complex in North Korea in exchange for step-by-step denuclearization of North Korea. So there were lower level of trust building, and the walking away from negotiation is damaging to the extent that we would question whether Kim Jong-un and his elites would believe the US government in the future for another round of summit diplomacy, if it is going to happen. And when it comes to South Korea, it is all about the ideological leaning of the party that the president elected to, and the role of South Korea, whether they act as a facilitator, moderator to US Dprk negotiation. And as I have mentioned earlier, the breakthrough with the Panmunjom and Pyongyang declaration. So this is a higher level of trust building that was succeeded under Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. So Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un recently, a few weeks ago, just expressed their intention to discuss about the end of Korean War declaration as one of the first steps towards a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So, but with the realistic and geopolitical condition remains, US Dprk now with no communication channel actively working between them, except the Dprk mission to the United Nations in New York that serve as the only channel for any US government officials to be able to engage the North Korean counterpart. And the warmongering statement narrative doesn't help with improving the situation either. And maintaining provocative status quo, meaning that when both sides chose not to engage each other, that means it again allows North Korea to buy more time to advance their weapon system. So there are dilemma in these approaches. Whereas between the inter-Korean process, North Korea often proactively reject the goodwill engagement and collaboration initiative coming from South Korea. So a lot of the efforts that South Korea has been constructing since the 90s can went back to ground zero just because of pure rejection by North Korea. So the difficulty in maintaining the momentum is said to be because of the lack of the third party platform for the inter-Korean to stand ground and to at least keep tab on what they have last done together. So last but not least, we need to face the ethical questions of sanctions, arms race, arms control, and the merits and demerits of engagement. So here I provide the merits of pressure and confrontational approach for the United States and their allies at least. Policy consistency and continuity is key. European partners at the moment also express that they are pessimistic at the condition on engaging North Korea because they have tried that after the sunshine policy introduced by Kim Dae-jung. So the European partners actually initiated European parliamentary delegation visit and diplomacy between the two Koreas. They also introduced more of their NGOs working on the ground in North Korea. And that seems that have been discontinued due to the heightened tension, nuclear tests, and the many sanctions regimes that were introduced afterwards. So the show of force by the United States together with Japan and South Korea often serve as a reminder to North Korea the reality of power asymmetry, and thereby to warn or signal to North Korea that there is no easy way to get out of this except by talking to them. But coming from a forceful position would actually toughen up North Korea's resolve to even to stand firmer on their ground and refuse to give in to the demand by the United States. So while North Korean elites may manage to maintain their position and power, North Korean people suffer the most. So the ethical question here is on the humanitarian grounds. Agriculture activities in North Korea are actively supported by third countries and also international NGOs, bringing in machine tools and the much needed mechanism and equipment from importing from China into North Korea. So right now, there is a very serious question about food security. Former NGO officials, workers who used to operate on the ground in North Korea in the middle of 90s expressed concerns over the food condition right now. And not to mention the human rights issues. Defectors are found to be reducing in great numbers due to the border lockdown, and the medical and health infrastructure is really concerning inside North Korea, even in Pyongyang right now. So whether North Korea can live up to their commitment to be accountable actor in this negotiation process is still living in limbo. So the strategic stability is also at the tipping point, whereby North Korea continue to devote a lot of national resources into modernizing their military forces, nuclear, and also missile programs. So the end of Korean War, is it truly the one of the best way to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula? So we still have lingering debates over sanctions relief and whether exemption for humanitarian aid can be provided. US forces in South Korea are often being characterized as the hostage on the Korean Peninsula. Because of them, that the US forces in Japan have more strategic flexibility. So if the war broke out, surely not only the US forces in Korea would serve as the first line of defense, but the reinforcement would surely come from US forces in Japan. So what does this mean for US alliance in the region, and in particular, US-ROK alliance? There are still very strong supporters, even among the progressive and liberal supporters in South Korea, that believe US-ROK alliance is necessary, even though they are not as steadfast, as strong as the US-Japan alliance. So they have contingency plans ready in case of regime collapse or humanitarian disaster occurred. And in case of a sudden movement from the Chinese side into North Korea, when that intervention scenario will complicate the situation further. So again, North Korea and China, to what extent their interdependence is high enough to also deter the US and its alliances from making a move on the Korean Peninsula. So this is the strategic consequences that we need to take into account. So last but not least, the role of the third-party platform, such as European Union, ASEAN, and Southeast Asian countries, are often overlooked. So let me end by the one example whereby all state actors and also NGOs around the world have no contact inside North Korea, but a Singaporean NGO, Chosen Exchange, was able to introduce I think at least 3 series of online lecture with North Korean students residing inside Pyongyang, and also North Korean citizens elsewhere around the world. So I look forward to your questions and discussion with what I have discussed just now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. for walking us through the DPRK issue and why it remains to be such an impossible problem to solve. A lot to unpack there. Having heard from our speaker, in a couple of minutes, I will turn to our audience for questions. To ask a question and or to comment, please use the raise hand function located on the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Wait to be called before speaking, and please state your name, position, and affiliation before commenting or asking questions. Alternatively, you can also post your question on the Q&A tab. But if you're going to use that, please remember to identify yourself by including your name and affiliation. For our live audience here in the classroom, please just raise your physical hand, then grab the microphone when recognized to speak. So, to jumpstart our conversation, let me first turn over to my colleague here in the room, Professor Shin So-jin, who will provide some of her thoughts. Professor Shin is Assistant Professor of Political Economy here at TIU. Professor Shin, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you very much, Dr. Hu, for a very interesting and clear lecture presentation about North Korea. Well, I really enjoyed and learned about North Korea's engagement or settlement with the neighboring countries. Well, there had been a positive mood, especially among the diplomats and the political leaders, especially between South Korea and the US, recently with a hope to declare the end of the Korean War. However, over the past few weeks, there were several unexpected variables emerging, disturbing the declaration preparation. And so we are not really anticipating that the declaration will be made very soon. My first question is about the view, how you see the position from American government in South Korea's preparation, the cooperation to declare the end of the war. And the second is we are organizing the presidential election very soon in the next few months in South Korea. What could be the best position for the next government to deal with the American government at the same time North Korea and further China as well regarding the Korean Peninsula issue? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Shin, for your question. So I think these are the issues that we are indeed wondering about. As for the current Moon government in Seoul, he is he will be highly receptive for any progress to be or action to be taken from the South Korean side to make this a reality or even materialize before the presidential election. However, as the United States and North Korea themselves know very well, if you don't know who is the power holder in the Cheongwade, you couldn't make any decision, a solid decision at that. So this is the fact that the South Korean government cannot reach a bipartisan agreement on the North Korean policy in the long term has harmed the prospect for too long in terms of making substantive moves on bringing the North Korean issues forward despite the change in government and the shifting of political ideology of the leader in question. So secondly, the current presidential candidates in South Korea already Mr. Yoon from the opposition party, which is from the conservative, has issued a statement, one written in Korean and the second one written in English, specifically aiming for the international audience. So it illustrates to what extent this is vital to South Korea's national interest and also their security dilemma. So in short, the main message is that Mr. Yoon is against the abrupt end of a Korean War declaration. So of course, who should be the party in jointly declaring the end? So to what extent China should be involved in this? And interestingly, the current ruling government's candidate also expressed reservation about this. So again, this shows that no one wants to make a very rush move when it comes to the end of Korean War declaration. And again, US troop withdrawal, whether they will stay on the Korean Peninsula. We know what China's and North Korean position would be, that is they prefer US no longer maintain presence in on the Korean Peninsula. So it is not to be resolved in a few months' time, of course. So given the realistic condition that we need to think about as well, even the talk of unification is a difficult issue to be grasped, because South Koreans' younger generation are highly opposing to the idea of a swift unification between the two Korea, even if it is going to happen. So yeah, I welcome more discussion about this point.
Thank you. Any question from the floor? Yes, Min.
Can you introduce yourself? Hello, Professor Hong. Thank you for your informative presentation. So my name is, I'm the fourth year IR student at TIU International University. And I would like to ask you, I think it's some questions. So my first question is that, so currently the deployment of AUKUS alliance between US, UK, and Australia, and North Korea raised a concern regarding the increase of nuclear arms race. And how do you think about the effect of AUKUS on the on North Korean US relation in the issue of Korean Peninsula? Especially North Korea raised a serious concern about that. And how would you comment regarding Biden's administration stand toward the issue? Will the Biden administration can resume back the dialogue, or what is the approach they choose to go? That's my first question. The second one is about the role you mentioned about the role of third party like EU or ASEAN in the issue, and I would like to ask in specific, like ASEAN. If it's ASEAN, then what ways or in specific, like in details, that ASEAN can play, like through what platform or to what mechanism? That's what I want to ask. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for your questions. So they are some of the tough ones as well. So firstly, on AUKUS, and as you mentioned, North Korea raised serious concerns over that. So given how North Korea is already a de facto nuclear armed state, and the fact that they may have achieved successes in their submarine launch ballistic missiles and the submarine modernization itself. So this is not a very welcoming catalyst for Northeast Asian states. So not only this would strengthen China and also North Korea's belief that the nuclear arms race is on, but the US together with their allies would, even though technically, the nuclear power submarine by Australia would not directly affecting the seas in Northeast Asia. However, the domino effect of nuclearization can be felt. So the United States have to assure both Japan and South Korea that the nuclear deterrence umbrella can be extended over them. However, it is highly likely that South Korea have the capability and intention to build their own capabilities in this area. So the submarine discussion before AUKUS has already quite alive in South Korea. So with the AUKUS and North Korean statement, it just pushed South Korea's intention to be more independent of US alliance restraint become even more obvious. So this is one concern about that. Personally, I feel Biden doesn't have a very clear strategy or policy direction on North Korea. And I'm afraid that it's going to be another phase of wait and see, and which already evidenced during Obama's time that it would only allow North Korea to buy more time. So if we don't engage North Korea now to take part in some form of arms control measures, before too late, it would be declare itself become a de facto of some other weapon systems. So on your second question about EU and ASEAN, so I mentioned that EU brought their NGOs and government parliamentary diplomacy engaging with the two Koreas and inviting them to Brussels and Berlin to have those engagements. As for ASEAN as a regional institution, it has their own limitation. Because of COVID-19, most of the ASEAN member states are now embroiled in their, are overly occupied with the health emergency response. A lot of the economic resources are going into building COVID-19 health infrastructure. So in terms of institutional contribution, definitely through ASEAN Regional Forum. So it is the only multilateral platform that North Korea, Dprk, is an official member of. So aside from United Nations, of course. So given the fact that they have lowered their level of representation at the ARF meeting, it should raise the alarm among the ASEAN member states that they should have prioritized Korean Peninsula as one of the key agenda within the ASEAN summit, but that could take a very long time to achieve. So at the moment, track 2 can be a very good way to keep North Korea in check. ASEAN's role is to socialize the difficult to be socialized countries. So in the past, it used to be Vietnam, the only socialist communist country in the region, and Myanmar, a so-called another rock state in Southeast Asia. So right now with the Myanmar crisis ongoing, so ASEAN's credibility is of course being questioned again. So, but we do successfully socialize one very big socialist power, and that is China. So with that experience in mind, only if Southeast Asian country can recognize the importance of making North Korea accountable for their action and being a member of East Asian regional community, only then the real agenda can be set up and actively engage North Korea throughout the institutional process.
All right, let's turn to our Zoom audience. We have some questions, so let me take all of them. We have 2 questions on the Q&A tab and then 1 raised hand. Amasha is asking, what are some of the contingency plans, if there are any, that the United States and the Republic of Korea have if the DPRK regime collapses? And then there's another question from an anonymous attendee about the end of war declaration. So obviously the Korean War is technically still ongoing. There has not been a treaty that officially ends the war. How is, or what are the prospects of having that end of war declaration signed without the participation of the Chinese? And hold your thoughts. Let's get the question of Kenzo. Kenzo, go ahead, please.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, so my name is Kenzo Bascoro. I'm a student in TIU International University. thank you very much for your lecture just now. We've learned so much about how we should see the issue of North Korea. I think my questions adds into your first statement when you talk about how China and South Korea could work their issues towards North Korea, but what's left behind is, I think, the question of Japan. I'm wondering on the questions on how realistic it is between the cooperation in Japan and South Korea in regards of North Korea issues, because we know that both states should have mutual interest when it comes to North Korea. But I do feel that even when the US is at the back trying to push the two states to talk about North Korea in a more constructive manner, we see how both of them are a bit pulled back. So I just wonder what's your opinion on how, just I guess, how realistic it is the two countries could do in order to engage with North Korea in the future.
All right, so I guess the question of Kenzo is about the ROK-Japan relations, right? Not really ideal. They're not on the same page on many issues. So is that an obstacle to cooperation in terms of engaging or confronting the DPRK? Over to you, Professor Hu.
Thank you. Very good quality of questions. So firstly, Amasha, thank you for asking about the contingency plans. So there was OPCON. So these are the code name for the plans between US and ROK. So they do conduct secret or backdoor diplomacy to talk to the Chinese counterpart, Japanese, and to prepare for any potential scenario. So the plan would often be updated. Since the 90s, the contingency plan was that due to the presence of North Korean defectors in South Korea, so some of them who were community leader before the defection, they were kept in touch with the South Korean government. In case of North Korean regime collapse, these, of course, the US and South Korea army, especially the South Korean ones, would enter the northern part of Korean Peninsula and thereby occupying the provinces and allow the North Korean defector to play the community leader's role in rebuilding North Korea, community by community, re by re, and also province by province. So this is one way of reducing the impact. And US-ROK, of course, have another unspoken plan in case China intervene from the northern part of North Korea if North Korean regime collapse. So that was the worst case scenario. So I have no idea about what the contingency plan for that looks like, but most probably talk first. So there must be some form of communication available, dialogue for the joint collaboration to take the situation under control. So I hope you are satisfied with this response. Secondly, it's about China's participation. Already during the first Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un's meeting at the Panmunjom, their initial Panmunjom declaration is without the mention of China. And already China reacted very strongly to that. And to think that Xi Jinping actually hijacked that golden moment that the first world leader to meet with Kim Jong-un face-to-face. It was supposed to be Moon Jae-in, but Xi Jinping had the honor instead by an overnight secret train running from North Korea into Beijing. So China would definitely react very strongly if they are not being considered as a party, and the Armistice Agreement of 1958 does have Peng Dehuai's signature on that piece of paper. So like it or not, South Korea and United States and North Korea, of course, should consult China as part of the process of declaration of the the end of Korean War. So next is the question raised by Kenzo. So I think Japan, South Korea is indeed a very complicated question and problem to work on. So as you all know, over the past many decades, Japan has tried their best to express their remorse and willingness to participate in bilateral mediation, consultation, collaboration. However, under Moon Jae-in administration, there are several instances where South Korea withdraw from, for example, intelligence sharing, hard labor issues, agreement, comfort women issues. So there is a lot of historical stumbling blocks for the two countries to walk on the same ground. So when it comes to working together on North Korea, I think if future South Korean and Chinese leader can embrace Japan jointly in talking to North Korea, I believe the issue of adopted Japanese victims to North Korea can be one channel. But it has to be approached differently, not from a place of condemnation, but willingness to make amends with each other. So Kim Jong-un so far has been refusing, even at the height of the summit diplomacy in 2018, refused several times Japan's offer to have a summit together. So I think Kim Jong-un has decided it is not a good idea to deal with Japan, even though I have personally evaluated that under Abe administration, it was sincere to reach some kind of a communication and also understanding to start any form of conversation. However, Kim Jong-un has steadfastly refusing that, no reason given. So we can only imagine that Japan has to offer more than requests to talk about Japanese abductee issues when it comes to North Korea.
All right, so let's go back to our live audience here in the classroom. Maybe we can take two questions at once. Kwan? Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for your informative presentation. So, my name is Kong from TIU International University, and the question I want to pose is, first, I want to clarify that I'm not specialized in Korean reconciliation or Korean unification, so allow me to view it from the global security perspective. So I will provide my question a little bit of my brief discussion on the question too. The first question is, shall we continue to view Korea, North Korea as a rogue state, or whether I think that, because I personally view it as a hyper-realist and rational state, because North Korea want to have the recognition that it is a de facto nuclear power, and by that recognition, it aims to have a better, higher leverage in dealing with international actors, for example, the US and China. So that's my first question is, how should we view North Korea? Because our view on North Korea will dictate how we view the approach to address North Korea on the global perspective. And the second question is, what is the extent or what is the chance for the US to work with China in addressing North Korea from the global security perspective? Because we cannot downplay the Chinese factors, because China is one of the biggest trading partner and biggest aid provider to North Korea. And it's also one of the countries that scared the most if anything happens to North Korean regime due to their flows of refugees and all the crises that follow it. So yeah, that's my two questions.
Thanks, Kwan. And we have one more from Bintang.
Thank you so much for the presentations. I have some questions. So it seems that from your presentations, it seems that North Korea does not respond positively to South Korean engagement efforts. Meanwhile, they also don't really crack under the US pressures, as well as sanctions and so on. So what does exactly North Korea desire from their international relations? However, in one of your answers, you mentioned that they had some sort of relations with China and Vietnam. So do they all only want to talk to socialist states? What do exactly they kind of desire? That's my question. The second one is that you mentioned briefly about the role of NGOs, and it's actually my first time hearing that Singaporean NGO could reach out to North Korean citizens. It seems quite interesting, but how exactly do you think NGO could play in international politics? Is there any way they could play a bigger role or a more influential role? And the third question, this is just a little bit from a whim, but you did talk a little bit about collapse of the North Korean regime. What kind of situation that could lead into that? It seems that the sanctions didn't work, the food insecurity and the poverty also didn't work. They have the succession of people in line. So is it even a possibility that the regime could collapse? I would imagine that they would have collapsed by now if they actually cracked under any pressures. So those are all my questions. Thank you so much.
All right, over to you, Dr. Hu.
Well, yeah, again, another great bunch of questions, and I really enjoy this. So I saw another question in chat by Premo Lamek, which is about security guarantee nuclear weapons vulnerable to be overthrown uprising outside of military intervention. So very quickly, North Korea's Kim Jong-un's objective is indeed to achieve the strong state and a strong or a sustainable economy development in North Korea. And this is why Byungjin was being introduced. So of the Byungjin, Byung means two parallel, right? So one parallel of nuclear has already achieved. So now left the economy. So I think if anything indicating running in the blood of the Kim family is that they fell at economy. So Kim Jong-un has been trying to rectify that by introducing small-scale informal economic practices, but now all of that has been rolled back under the pandemic. So we see that the cancellation of reform efforts as extremely concerning. So we already know that sanctions doesn't have any impact, but then again, it was the domestic policy that can affect people's livelihood the most. So a lot of the private assets has been seized by the regime. The security apparatus within the country has been tightened over the pandemic. So the return to the hard authoritarianism approach would destroy Kim Jong-un's legacy in modernizing Pyongyang, the city-state, and also the border cities with China, because these are some of his more remarkable non-military contributions to North Korea in the past 10 years. So we hope to convince North Korea not to go along that track. So in terms of security guarantee, North Korea trying to reach an agreement with the United States acknowledging North Korea as a normal state. So they want to be recognized as a sovereign state with their own will, not a crazy madman state, not a rogue state, so to say. So they are trying to have themselves being treated normally by the US, and that is the main objective. So thereby with that, I brought over the answering to Cole and also Bing Tang's question. So how should we deal with North Korea then? In my past, okay, I'm going to reveal my age here, almost, so a very long time of observation. North Korea actually is quite receptive towards NGOs initiative. And this is something the government don't see the value in for quite a long time, even though they are aware of those NGOs' contribution to North Korea and advancing not US-North Korea negotiation. So the first breakthrough that led to the agreed framework signed in 1994 after the first nuclear crisis is actually because of a track 2 academic discussion done between the US and North Korean and South Korean academics that give rise to the hope that there is a solution to this discussion. Japanese academic was involved as well. And that was why Japan and South Korea were the main sponsor of the KIDO, Korean Energy Development Organization. So to replace the nuclear weapons program with the light water reactor for electricity supply in North Korea. So as we knew, Bush administration, so again, the domestic politics of the United States failed that engagement approach and process. And when we have to redo all over the 6-party talks led by China, so even China has actively promoting engagement, negotiation, reconciliation with North Korea. But then again, financial warfare launched by Bush administration destroy the deep pocket of Kim Jong-il, and thereby he went to Jiang Zemin and also later Hu Jintao for help. And this is why North Korea has a high level of dependency on China over the course of Kim Jong-il's rule. And Kim Jong-un wanted to mark a difference. And this is the one little hope that we can rely on right now, is that he sees the pros and cons of having China as the supporting North Korea. However, over-reliance on China is not ideal for North Korea's autonomy and agency in international relations. So from the global security perspective, if US and China is going to work together on the North Korean issue, North Korea would distance itself from China. And that has already been tested by Xi Jinping in 2017. And we all know that that year is a highly provocative year. So a Chinese researcher who often visit North Korea actually shared with us that now even North Korea hate us. So China right now don't see the reason of supporting US initiative in having any kind of new policy towards North Korea, because China regarded its own approach on North Korea as the most reliable one. So, and of course, the US-China strategic rivalry also means it is even more difficult to find convergence and interest on the Korean Peninsula from now on. So, Bintang, your remaining question is about the North Korean openness. It's not limited to socialist partner. Otherwise, there won't be any exchanges between ASEAN and North Korea. So Malaysia, before being cut off diplomatic ties, is not a socialist state either. So as Singapore, Brunei, Thailand, Indonesia. So what these countries have done and their NGOs was to focus on the area that is very specific, contributing towards people's livelihood. Canadian and American NGO focus on food nutrition. So they introduce soy milk as the protein replacement. Protein is very hard to come by in North Korea. That's why they are the country with the highest number of TB still existing until today. So we have maintained some form of a medical professional expert exchange. Malaysia have a medical assistant agency, Mercy Malaysia, that extend medical help such as eye surgery, treating children with malnutrition, and so on and so forth. We also contributed finance in building more childcare home and provide better equipping North Korea's hospital facilities. So all of this means that there are other entry points in engaging North Korea, and the government should open their eyes facing all these more pertinent and urgent issues of the people if we can't deal with the North Korean leadership. And North Korea is not just about Kim Jong-un and his elite circles. It is also about the middle class, arise over the past 10 years under Kim Jong-un, because how the informal private market activities are allowed, the Jangmadang generation. There is also the farmer agriculture is still the majority activity in North Korea. There were also the elite children, people who are selected to live in Pyongyang. And this is why they have better internet connection facilities there, have cell phones and such. So there are, again, many ways. Sanction didn't work, but some pressure needs to be applied to make sure cyber attacks, cyber operation did not get out of hand coming from North Korea, because that is one way for them to acquire financial means to fund their nuclear and also ballistic missile programs. So when engaging North Korea, we need to think ethically how best to engage them, and in different tracks of policy, diplomacy, economic, and also military. Thank you so much.
Right. We're running out of time, but with the indulgence of our speaker, if there is any last minute question from the audience, we can maybe get one or two. Christopher, can you please approach the mic?
Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful session of the panelists here. First of all, my name is Christopher. Nice to meet you. I'm fourth year IR student here at the University. I came from Indonesia, as you might know, one of the few countries that have embassies in North Korea. And just a quick question, simple one. What is it that made the North Koreans the center of attention when it comes to nuclear threat? Well, we almost never heard or talked about the, for example, the Pakistani nuclear program or the Chinese nuclear program. Why is it that in the Pacific region we see that the North Koreans are the center of attention of the nuclear threat? Especially since the Dprk regime is, relatively speaking, is quite stable in terms of the nuclear threat. Thank you very much.
All right, so I think the question is about the attention that North Korea has been getting over its nuclear weapons program when we have other nuclear weapons proliferator in the region, for example, Pakistan, India, Israel, and yet these countries have not really gotten the attention of the world, or they are not even sanctioned over these things. So what are your thoughts on that? And I think we can end there. And I'll give you the last few minutes as well to offer, maybe provide us with some closing remarks. Over to you, Dr. Hu.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Daniel, for giving me another few minutes to cover this issue. In fact, this is the very reason that North Korea used in their official statement that the US and international community are being unfair because the attention are overly focused on North Korea's nuclear weapons program, whereas a lot of US partners themselves were engaged in such activities. And Pakistan's nuclear and ballistic missiles program are indeed a product of collaboration between with North Korea. And in the process, Malaysia accidentally become a middleman for some of the parts, dual-use technology for proliferation. And thereby, countries in Southeast Asia heighten their attention to this matter, and Malaysia become one of the first country in the region to set up Strategic Trade Act to better track the dual-use technologies unintentional transfer that may ended up in North Korea's hand, and also the other way around, from North Korea proliferated to the Middle East. So Israel has often involved in many of the covert operations undermining North Korea's nuclear weapons development. For instance, they launched cyber attack on Iranian's nuclear facility. They also claims that they assassinated North Korean scientists in Iran, in Yemen, in Libya. So where they are spotted and found. So the nuclear proliferator involved the middleman position. Myanmar was a candidate in the late 2000s when they resumed bilateral relations after the Rangoon bombing in the 1980s. Pakistan is now cutting clean of their direct ties with North Korea when it comes to proliferation issues. However, Iranians is still on top of the list in terms of this area. So the fear of nuclear terrorism is still there. And the fact that North Korea announced its intention to develop hypersonic missiles. So those emerging weapon systems seems to be a new forte for North Korea. And this is something that we need to persuade US, South Korea, and many other major stakeholders to bring North Korea into the talks of arms control. So this is already beyond denuclearization. And I hope as global security students, you bear that in mind as well when one day you hold a position to negotiate on this issue.
All right. We are out of time. And thanks a lot to our speaker, Professor Chiew Ping from Malaysia. This has been a very illuminating and enjoyable session. And also special thanks to those who tuned in over via Zoom. Just one announcement before we end. The final TIU Global Dialogue event for this year is scheduled on December 16 at 9 p.m. It's a roundtable discussion entitled Doing IR Differently, Relational Cosmologies Around the World, organized by TIU and International Christian University in Tokyo. And that's going to be hosted by my colleague, Professor Chris Lamont. So to those interested in non-Western international relations series, please register for that. So that's it for today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. ありがとうございます。